there is still a path for diplomacy. We must take it. Otherwise, violence and destruction could reach unimaginable levels.
China calls on all parties to step up efforts to de-escalate.
Return to the negotiation table and prevent further escalations. Extended war benefits no one.
We're working very hard to prevent the attacks of Israel and its supporters against our neighbor Iran from turning into an even bigger disaster.
Welcome. Iran has launched missile strikes against U.S. forces in the Gulf. Tehran says the strikes came in response to the U.S. bombing of key nuclear sites in the country at the weekend. Explosions were seen over Qatar on Monday evening after the country closed its airspace. No casualties have been reported. It's also been reported that Iran informed the U.S. in advance of the attack on the Al-Udeid Airbase. U.S. President Donald Trump visited the base last month, calling it a signal of U.S. strength. About 10,000 U.S. troops are stationed at Al-Udeid, which is the regional headquarters of U.S. Central Command. For more, let's speak to Daniel Gerlach, editor-in-chief of Zenith magazine, which focuses on the Arab and Islamic world. Daniel, good to see you. We've seen Iran fire missiles at the Al-Udeid Air Base, but it does appear it gave advanced warning that it was about to do so. What do you read into that?
Well, the Al-Udeid Air Base, or military base, was one of the most unlikely targets because Qatar, the host country of this base, is one of the countries that holds very close relations with the Iranian regime. It has been very instrumental in negotiations. Qatar also shares a major gas field with Iran. So Qatar and Iran have achieved in the last couple of years to entertain some amicable relations. So the Al-Udeid base is an important American base, an important American target. So it's within reach of Iranian missiles. But however, the political costs are high. What we see here is, in my view, a bit of a scene that is reminiscent of 2020 when the Americans killed the Iranian Major General Qasem Soleimani on the airport road in the middle of Baghdad. When this happened, the Iranians felt obliged to retaliate, and they struck the Ain al-Assad air base in Iraq, which they have done, by the way, also now, as far as I know. And they gave the Americans a heads up, a warning, in order to make sure that no American servicemen are killed, because first of all, they don't want to harm any Qataris, but they also seem not to want to harm any American soldiers, because that would force the Americans for a much bigger response on Iran.
And where do you place this on the spectrum of the possible Iranian responses that we could have seen to American strikes on its nuclear facilities? Do you think this is intentionally limited, or is it the start of something much bigger?
No, I think it is intentionally limited because, of course, Iran could have struck other targets, but that doesn't mean that this is limited to this. This was one attack, 2 attacks, probably 3, but that doesn't mean that the war is over yet. The American strikes were an open declaration of war on Iran. It's the first time that America has struck, with, let's say, a limited exception of the Iran hostage crisis in 1980. It's the first time that America struck Iran directly and announced and officially also took credit for it. So, of course, Iran feels in a very difficult situation and has a lot of lose-lose options. However, we have to see, a bit probably differentiate between the relationship of Iran with its Gulf state neighbors, its relationship with the United States and Israel. Israel seems to be, and to what extent the United States is behind that is unclear for the moment. Israel seems to be reaching for a regime change in Iran. It has struck targets in Iran that have absolutely nothing to do with the nuclear program. And so the conclusion that the Iranian regime draws from that is that Israel, and probably with American backing, is trying to oust it and replace it. And that's a situation in which the Iranian regime, of course, feels cornered and would be much less risk-averse than it used to be in the past.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Israel continues to attack Iranian targets linked to its nuclear and missile programs, also members of the Revolutionary Guard's Al-Quds force. Do you think Israel would have United States backing in trying to seek regime change?
The question here is, what does that imply? What kind of a political strategy? A regime change, you do not change a regime by just like bombing the political leadership of the current regime. I think that is a conclusion that should be drawn from all catastrophic intervention policies in the region and elsewhere in the last couple of decades. So I don't think that let's focus a bit on what Israel did last night. There was a strike on, as far as I know, the administrative building of the notorious Evin prison in Tehran. This prison is surrounded by, let's say, middle class and upper middle class residents in Iran that are in general not hostile but critical of the regime, and that probably would also like to get rid of the regime. However, this strike in the middle of a residential area on a political symbol of the Iranian regime, the Evin prison holds many political prisoners also, is not something that would win the Iranians over for the United States, let alone for Israel. So whereas many people in Iran are anti-regime, they have absolutely no compassion, no understanding, and no, let's say, support, and no good feelings for Israeli attempts to change the political landscape in Iran. People are very much against that, and that's something that needs to be factored in. Of course, the Americans are talking about bringing back the son of the last Shah of Iran, and he also has announced that he has some political ambitions, but I don't see any credible and any plausible scenario of regime change at the moment.
And what about diplomacy with the current regime? I mean, even if we accept that the Americans and Israelis together have bought time in delaying Iranian nuclear capabilities, which the details of that remain unclear, what do you do with that additional time? Do you see possible negotiations?
I don't see that. I don't see that at the moment, for the simple reason that President Trump, one day he tweets about diplomacy, then he talks about unconditional surrender, then he talks about regime change. The Israelis are doing quite the same thing. So the Europeans that are trying to negotiate and negotiate a deal are making very much fools of themselves. And then you have a situation where the German chancellor, who could be a voice of reason in the European camp, unequivocally supports military action. Now, you can say that European powers also see a benefit in a weakening of the Iranian regime. But of course, you deprive yourself of any possibility of negotiating and playing a meaningful role in negotiations when you come up with statements as Chancellor Friedrich Merz did. So I frankly do not see any role for the Europeans here to negotiate a deal, because they are dealing with conflict parties like the United States, Israel, and Iran that are not only unpredictable, but they seem also not to be really willing to engage in such a deal.
Yeah, and are there any other options open to other states in the region to mediate potentially?
Well, that's an interesting question. Of course, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Kuwait, Iraq would play a role here. They have condemned, as far as the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, is concerned, the attacks of Iran on U.S. targets in the Gulf region, of course, on their own territories. But of course, for the Gulf states, the hosting U.S. troops in the region is coming at a cost, because so far they thought that the presence of U.S. troops would protect them against military conflict. Now they see that hosting these American troops could also quite lead to an opposite scenario. And I think that is also something that a message that the Iranians want to send to the Gulf states. The Gulf states can mediate, but again, mediation attempts with regard to the war in Gaza, which is still going on and where day after day dozens of people get killed by the IDF, have failed. And so I don't see any credible scenario that even the Gulf states would come to a conclusion. I think the only way that the Iranians can now alleviate the situation is de-escalate, and the Americans can do the same by not responding. This is what they have done in Iraq in 2020 when President Trump was also at the helm. But I think it is quite unlikely that they're going to do that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today with your insights. We've been speaking with Daniel Gerlach.
Thank you.
And we have journalist Karim El-Gawhary following the story for us and joining us live from Cairo. Karim, so glad you could speak with us about this. Tell us the latest that we know about these Iranian attacks.
Well, for now, it seems to be over. All the airspaces that were closed, not over Qatar only, but also over other Gulf states, are opened again. So that seems to be it for tonight. This, of course, was the Iranian answer to an American attack on their nuclear facilities 2 nights ago. But it interesting. It was an attack. We had no casualties. All the 6 missiles were fired. They were all intercepted. It's interesting that this was not an attack that was designed to kill as many U.S. soldiers or U.S. personnel as possible. It was a very calculated answer. It was, for example, that there was through diplomatic channels, the Iranians notified the Qataris, and through the Qataris also the Americans, that this is going to happen. They also knew that this base that was attacked, the Udeid Airbase, the biggest US airbase in the region, was mostly evacuated in the last days. So it looks like it was an attack in order to do something, saving their face, but not to create major damage. It's now very important, of course, how the US is going to react to this. But it seems like that the Iranian side is not interested to escalate this thing now out of control.
And what about Iran? Have they said anything officially about this attack?
Well, Khamenei itself, the supreme leader, said that we won't accept any aggression against us. They're, of course, going to show that this is something big because it's something they want to save their face. So internally, they're talking it up, but I think it's clear that this is an attack that is really not designed to escalate the situation in the Middle East further.
And what about Qatar? Its foreign ministry condemned this attack as a flagrant violation of its sovereignty. Do you think we could see a Qatari response?
No, I don't think so. I mean, they condemned it. They condemned it also together with other GCC countries. They also said this is a violation of international law. But don't forget, Qatar is not known for its military operations. Qatar is known to be a mediator. And it was a mediator between Israel and Hamas. And it is together with Oman, the 2 countries in the Gulf that are most sympathetic towards Iran, that are possible mediators between the Iranian regime and the US. So I think that's the card that Qatar is going to play now, that they will say that this was not a major attack. Now it's the time for diplomacy, and Qatar probably is going to hope to play some role here.
Yeah, and Karim, the facts on the ground are changing day by day here, but what implications do you think this latest attack will have for the region?
It depends a little bit like how this is continuing. It depends, are the Iranians going to do more? And more important, what is US President Donald Trump going to do about it? So this might be the beginning of further escalation, but as it looks like, and I think also as it was designed by the Iranians, that they hope this is now the beginning, the end of the hostilities between the direct hostilities between the US and Iran. But that, of course, doesn't mean that the war between Israel and Iran is going to stop. The Israelis continue to bombard various places in Iran. Iran is still firing their rockets to Israel. But it seems like that the Iranians are not interested to open really another big front towards the US. I think they hope that with tonight that this chapter is going to be closed.
And that has really been the key question here. Thank you so much, Karim, for sharing your insights. That's Karim El-Gawhary joining us from Cairo.
You're welcome.
And what about the Americans? Well, let's get the view from Washington, D.C., from DW's Misha Komadovsky. He's been following this developing story for us. Misha, just start us off with the latest of what we know about the attack on the U.S. military's Al-Udeid Airbase in Qatar.
Well, Claire, we've just heard from President Trump on Truth Social. He claims that Iran responded weakly to a U.S. strike on its nuclear facilities and praises the U.S. military for effectively countering the missile attack. He emphasized that no Americans were harmed thanks in part to early warning from Iran. He just confirmed it. And Trump hopes that this exchange marks the end of hostilities and promotes the idea of moving toward peace in the region. Let me quote here, perhaps Iran can now proceed to peace and harmony in the region, and I will enthusiastically encourage Israel to do the same. Thank you for your attention to this matter. And President Trump suggested that, most importantly, Iran had released its aggression. And he says, and I quote here, they've gotten it all out of their system, and that hopefully there would be no further hostility. Previously, we've heard from a U.S. official saying the White House was closely monitoring the situation, hoping there won't be any escalation in the region. Now the U.S. confirmed that Iran had communicated in advance of the attack at the Al-Udeid base, which is home to thousands of U.S. troops. A U.S. official said Iran fired medium-range missiles after warning both Qatar and the United States, and no American casualties have been reported. Previously, a Qatari government official confirmed that Al-Udeid Airbase had been evacuated ahead of the Iranian missile attack, citing pre-approved security measures and rising tensions in the region.
So just broadening things out to look at where we go from here, do you think we're likely to see any future efforts at diplomacy after this?
Well, the big question now is whether peace is still achievable after the shots were fired. President Trump had previously, as we remember, voiced support for a diplomatic solution with Iran, but after the recent attacks, the message from Washington has been somewhat more mixed, and Trump is hinting that regime change in Iran could be a possibility, while Vice President Vance stated earlier that the U.S. is not pursuing this goal. Now President Trump posted before his latest statement, and I quote, "The sites that we hit in Iran were totally destroyed, and everyone knows it. Only the fake news would say anything different in order to try and demean as much as possible." And then he proceeded to verbally attack journalists. We're not going to dive into that now. The devil is in the details here, Claire, because President Trump claims the strikes completely and totally obliterated the Iranian nuclear sites. And the Pentagon officials, on the other hand, used more cautious language, describing extremely severe damage and saying they believe Iran's capabilities at Fordow were effectively destroyed. And new intelligence suggests there is a possibility that Iran had moved enriched uranium from its main nuclear sites, and these attacks have made an already tense situation in the region even more dangerous, adding new risks to the ongoing conflict.
Well, thank you so much for that update. We've been speaking with DW's Misha Komadovsky in Washington.